Because behind every consumer, there's a human being. And if there is a human being, there is a story, right?
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. As folks trickle in, I'll start with introductions. My name's Kim Larson. I'm a client success manager here at Luminoso. And today I am joined by Mag, president and founder of Clarteza. Mag, thank you for joining us today. And do you want to start off by telling us a quick bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I manage Clarteza, a marketing strategy and insights company. We are deeply passionate about understanding people, and especially in context of innovation. So we fuse fundamentals of psychology, neuroscience, design thinking, all of it with disruptive technologies like Luminoso to deepen and broaden the insights.
Thanks, Mag. So for today's webinar for our audience, we invited Mag to help us learn how organizations and anyone, even at the individual level, can get in the passion-driven research advantage, and we'll cover what that is. So let's start with, we're starting by covering what is the passion-driven advantage. We'll go over that. Which markets have this advantage? Why do these markets have this advantage, and how to bridge the gap for your stakeholders. Obviously, this is a skill that researchers utilize every day, but it's an essential skill for researchers who need to use this to ask their internal stakeholders what they need, what do they really want, and for internal stakeholders to get a better understanding of what are the researcher capabilities. So this should be appropriate for everyone. After this webinar, we should see no more flat questions, one-word answers if we don't need to give those. So let's start. Meg, what is the advantage?
So the real question really is, where is the advantage and why is this really important? And anywhere essentially people feel passionate about something they do, something they believe in, and anything then they like to talk about. So that could be anything rooted in their personal interest and anything that's tied to their identity and experiences in general, really both positive and negative. When we tap into those elements, we tend to unlock the interesting point of view from the consumer.
It's true. Folks who know me know that I'm passionate about my dogs. Any of the clients on the call know that I've talked about my dogs at length, even when it's not necessary. And I know that Mag here is important or is passionate about health and wellness, travel, arts, creativity, for various reasons.
For sure. Yeah, the arts and creativity fuel innovation, and that's just a big passion of mine and why I do what I do.
It's true. And in our recent webinar with No Man's Sky, like gamers, like that is an identity. So we'll see a lot of passionate stories and reviews about games, even if it's unsolicited. But how does that convert into an advantage?
So let's say I manage a brand in the fitness industry and I want people to buy more of my product. Sort of a typical objective that clients would come to us with. First, what I need to do is understand what language people use when talking about their sport, their passion. What this will do is inform me on how I should talk about my brand, and ideally in what context. So when we would ask a question, we look for emotional drivers and why their sport matters to people. And what I want to discover is, where does my brand, well, our client's brand, fit in the journey? Where can we meet the interest of the consumer with the brand that we have? I want to establish the connection with their sport and their passion. Now, when people are passionate about their topic, I see it right away with the quality of answers I get. And it's both in qualitative and quantitative settings, really. I mean, sometimes you have the moment that you unlock the person on the other side and you get excited. If they're passive, on the other hand, and not as interested, we'll get boring answers. And then we sort of have to go back to the drawing board. How else can we ask the question in a different way to be able to unlock the insight that we're hoping to to find? And why is this important? Why does it really matter? When you want to expand the reach of your product, you want to make sure you highlight what really matters to the people that might like to buy that product, right? So not just the functional elements of the product or service, but the ultimate benefits, right? This is what really moves people. So, for example, when we conducted a study about wine, fascinating category, and asked about the pivotal moments when people started consuming wine. We learn about travel stories, family dinners, first dates, and uncomfortable exchanges during those days. Those are the meaningful moments that people were associating the wine with those situations. We also conducted several studies in the fitness and ballroom and dance industry. And when we asked what dance means to people, I was able to get deep answers, paragraphs, and often essays. This was really quite exhilarating because there were moments where I felt I had an insight into people's souls. That was quite transformative, right? It was quite transformative to me personally, but to the brand, because, it felt like I was reading somebody's diary and looking into their deep thoughts, which was really quite incredible.
Yeah, let's take a look at one of the things that you did in that study for that studio. Thank you for sharing it with us. So Meg, you want to tell us about what we're seeing here?
Sure. So this is just literally one answer of a person that we asked, what will the ideal ballroom studio look like? And as you can see, it's very deep and thorough. And when we were looking at the galaxy and associations, we could see that atmosphere is coming up, and you want to have the fun while learning. Instructors are knowledgeable. Competition is definitely an important factor. And then we have the elements of functional, easy to get, and parking availability. So when we're looking at the entire context of the question that we have, we can get a lot of interesting insights. And in the past, getting the open-ended questions in quantitative settings specifically was expensive because it was time-consuming, and often answers were subjectively coded by someone who knew a lot about the coding process, but perhaps wasn't as familiar with every potential category. Or the hidden meaning of dance in this particular case, right? So now what we're doing is the deeper answers we get, the more excited we are, and the better it is. Because with AI, we literally can analyze all of it, and we can twist and turn the data and look for really seemingly unrelated connections. So we get to uncover answers to questions we were not even looking for, and that's really gold, because when you're finding something in the data that you are not expecting, and you wish you knew to ask about it, and all of a sudden sort of it surfaces in the data, that's really quite incredible.
And you can really only get it with open ends, right? Because if you're working only with scored or structured questions, there's not much room for discovery. It's mostly evaluation at that point. But you do evaluation too. So if we go to the next slide.
Yep.
What did you do here, Meg?
Yeah, so the element of what dance means to people, we looked in a variety of different ways. And we looked for the drivers. And in this particular case, what we learned, that dance brings joy. It's a creative outlet. I mean, those are things that you would sort of expect in a way if I was coming up with a quantitative question and asked, for different attributes associated with it. However, in the driver's analysis, we discovered that there is a difference between what dance means to people depending on the age group. And that was really fascinating because we had no idea that for the group 35 to plus, 35 to 65 approximately, emotional healing was one of the key the drivers in this particular case. And then we were thinking about it, but well, it made sense. You know, by the time you're 35 to 65, you have a lot of life experiences, good and bad, you know, and you know, for some of us, ballroom dancing was an emotionally healing outlet, which was a big deal. While for the younger population, the 25 to 35-year-old, was all about the challenge. You know, this was an incredibly important finding because this changed this communication strategy for the company that we worked with. Obviously, if you want to communicate to the 25 to 34-year-old, you might not necessarily want to talk about emotional healing as the first driver and not the other way around. I mean, there were some overlaps, obviously, but that was a very interesting finding for us.
Yeah, 15 mentions is not bad for emotional healing, but yeah, not the same as challenge being a bit higher. All right, so what about, so you know, like for our spectators, of course dance will have storyful things. It's a creative outlet. Maybe there's more verbose language there. But you know, I get to work with a lot of clients where maybe they're studying domains that are more difficult or to get storyful data on. For example, finances or like mobile video games that are just, you know, not heavily invested in, or if someone were to ask me about carpentry tools, like I'm not going to have an opinion on it. I'm gonna be like, does it assemble IKEA furniture? Like that is my level. So how do you suggest we tackle more challenging topics where maybe it's difficult to get storyful stuff?
I think it's a great point, Kim. But you mentioned something about IKEA. You know, the tool is essentially for you is just to get to the furniture to be finished, right? So it's not, you're not looking for a perfect tool. You're looking for the end goal, right? And that's part of the message that I'm trying to convey with what you're trying to capture with your questions. So the root of the challenge. There isn't this necessarily a topic that's you know, impossible to get deep answers on. It's more of, you know, finding the right prompt in this context. It's the way we ask the question that can really change the trajectory of the project. And not only that, it can change the quality of insights we uncover. And my goal with the questions that we ask, and believe me, asking good questions is not easy. Sometimes we go back and forth and try it out and see if it works. But my ultimate goal is to establish a connection with your respondent. Asking a question in such a way that might surprise them, engage them, excite them, make them ponder. What you're looking for is emotional load behind the subject matter. So asking a thoughtful question is not necessarily easy, but if you find the right one, you know, it's absolutely worth it.
Are you trying to make surveys enjoyable?
I'm sorry?
Are you trying to make surveys enjoyable?
That's correct. Create a positive experience. How about that, right? So, you know, just it's all about sort of reframing of the situation, because you want to get to know the other person on the other end, right? So think of questions when you want to establish a more meaningful conversation with someone, just in general, another individual. You know, on a plane, and you're sitting next to one another for the next 3 to 4 hours. How do we engage in the conversation? For me personally, sometimes I wonder whether I have it on my forehead, please talk to me, because I learn a lot about the other person's life. But, you know, instead of where you're from and what you do, ask them something about what is the highlight of your day? What is the personal or professional project that you've been engaged in? really the objective here is to establish a meaningful dialogue. You want to have the situation that both parties enjoy being in the conversation together.
Yeah, and I've seen this like the other day I was on a date and I overheard someone having kind of that similar challenge of like asking really simple questions, and it was just a really unilateral conversation. So one person got to know the other more
Yep.
so than it being mutual. And I'll recognize when folks come to us and they say, well, I have open-ended text data, they often have a template, like with the starter questions that are, really helpful if you're using a standard NLP approach instead of an NLU, like language understanding approach, like what we have. And so let's take a look at the standard questions, the status quo. What do we see the most often? I see this a lot in like HR or human resources questions where it's like, what do you like about working here? Short answer. What do you dislike about working here? Something. Same thing with a lot of the consumer goods. They'll ask this kind of standard question template. And then anything else? What did we miss? And this allows them to kind of like quantify like how liked is the service or how disliked is the price. But it leaves us vulnerable to a lot of issues, and like it leaves the company vulnerable because the analyst or the researcher then is tempted to speculate on how to change the price instead of being told, well, what is it about the price, or what is it about the service? And so to get beyond this, I'll see some researchers defer to, well, what if we just pay the clients, or we pay the respondents? Not an issue that I think some of our market research clients have, but some of the DIY researchers, I'll see this. And it makes sense. Like, if I'm not getting storyful feedback from my questions, well, I should just set a character minimum and pay them, and that will result in getting more storyful feedback. But that's not universally the case. Anyone who's like evaluated elementary, middle school, high school homework, like, well, if there's a minimum word count, you figure out how to fluff. Most adults in society are very good at fluffing answers to hit minimum word counts. So this is where we'll defer to Meg. What alternatives do people have to compensation?
Right, and there's a place for it. I mean, we absolutely do this as well. I mean, and if you're having a person for 2 hours and you want to make sure that they're compensated for their time, and our role is to ask interesting questions and create an experience for them, so they don't feel it's so painful for them to be sitting for 2 hours, but rather it's entertaining, engaging, exciting, because at the end of the day, we get better answers that way as well. So survey fatigue is indicative of drop in motivation for sure. The thought of even, interestingly, of taking a survey, even personally, when I see a big survey with a lot of attributes and long lists for me to review, it creates a cognitive friction. It makes me not even want to try to start that survey. So, this is one of those situations that you don't want to create you don't want to create an experience that it feels like this unwanted homework, right? What works better is creating an experience that creates a cognitive ease. So making a survey, taking easy, flawless, frictionless, essentially, make it fun if possible, right? And I realize, and we've had all kinds of surveys over the years, that it's not always so simple. But if you can, if there's a, quote unquote, a painful survey, explain why the answers matter, and how will you use those answers to improve the product. So, engage in surprising, if you have that situation, also engage in a surprising question, something that creates novelty, something that survey takers might not expect necessarily, but if they do see it, they might get a little excited, especially if you ask them a question that they're deeply interested in the topic. And with that, you have this beautiful dopamine release. And why does this matter? Dopamine is a chemical in the brain, made in the brain. It's called a molecule of more. We like it, we crave it. It is released often with activities, that are related to mere anticipation, novelty, surprises, with pleasure. So, for example, in my ballroom dancing project, whether it was qualitative and quantitative, we did not always pay people. Participants in those studies were so deeply vested in their hobby, in their activity, right? That they really wanted to be a part of. We had sometimes more volunteers that we needed really to get enough sample or enough respondents. So we even had to, or not to mention, we had to cut down the time, because the surveys sometimes were, 8 to 10 minutes we assumed, and they ended up being 20 to 30. So it was really, really, and it was not because of the design, it was because people really were pouring their hearts out with creative prompts that we had. So it is absolutely important to look for the stories, and I'm a big believer in those. So when we ask people to share their point of view, we look to uncover the deeper meaning behind the product or the service that they're engaging with. So we look for values, unmet needs, and sometimes subconscious drivers. Our goal is to understand the consumer, because behind every consumer, there is a human being. And if there is a human being, there is a story, right? So it's all about understanding people. And as humans, we have a lot of influences, right? So we have the biases, which we're not even aware of often. They stem from habitual behavior or some sort of a conditioning. Unspoken thoughts, those are interesting ones. Those we don't want to necessarily share because they feel embarrassing, or you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings by saying something. We're just, plainly uncomfortable. And then we have the verbalized thoughts, and those are the ones that, you craft together and put it nicely on paper or share it with somebody. So getting paid for responding doesn't necessarily take the biases or unspoken thoughts into consideration.
Right. People will say what they think, and if you compensate, they'll find a longer way to say it. So we have other ways of doing it. So compensation is the one that I think I've seen people refer to the most. But then you've also touched on two other topics related to the dopamine bit.
Well, sure. I mean, the element of altruism is a big one. So let respondents know that their feedback will make a difference, that they feel, they're part of the process or making something or a product better. And then we have the symbiotic, right? Them making the process of responding satisfying, gamify it, make it thought-provoking, make it engaging, make it experiential almost for them.
Yeah, product reviews, I think, tap into the altruistic drive of, I have an opinion about this and it is strong one way or the other. I want someone else to benefit from this good thing that I experienced, or I want someone to avoid the pitfall that I experienced. So I think we see a lot of altruism drive in product reviews. As a result, we see kind of polarizing feedback, not necessarily the neutral bell curve of experience, so it may not be purely representative, but it's why we get some good storyful feedback there. So we promised our audience that we would go over some sample prompts. So if you are used to the status quo of like, dislike, and other, we have some alternatives and some suggestions. So thank you to the Tukwila School District for attending and submitting our first question. For the alternative of level 1, if you're doing the DIY approach, what is a replacement for what do you like, and what is a replacement for what do you dislike. In this example, what is enabling students to succeed in their learning outcomes, and what conditions need to be in place in order for those factors to work. It adds an additional layer of nuance that the straightforward like-dislike question didn't have. We flip it for hindering and accommodations, and this starts to enable respondents to come up with an action plan. So that way the analyst or the researcher doesn't have to speculate on ways to change it. You can hear it directly from the external stakeholders. And instead of having any other questions or concerns, or questions or comments where feedback is often no, kind of like what Mag said, or exactly as Mag said, mentioning that the feedback is going to result in change or is going directly to the stakeholders that are making the decisions. We get some really good storyful feedback with this approach. But this is more of a basic DIY home-baked approach. So if you don't have the resources, or what you're evaluating doesn't necessarily require a researcher, this is a good place to start. But we have a lot of examples that do require researchers. So I'll take us to level 2, and Mag, you can explain.
Right. So this is an interesting one, right? This one has tension. When we talk about bugs and rodents, for most of us, not all of us, but for most of us, the thought of a cockroach crawling on my table, it evokes fear, disgust, and honestly even anger. It's really a very emotional category. So let's say a pest control company wants to develop a new product and create a new positioning. Our role really is to find how can we effectively address the emotional load associated with pests or rodents in this case. So there are a lot of different ways that we can approach this. Again, you want to look for the stories, and boy, even between Kim and I, we have stories, so we will share. But yeah, when you take a look at this, you can put yourself in the situation when you're sitting at a friend's dinner party and you see a cockroach scuttle across the floor. You can imagine what emotions that might elicit. And the question is, what are your first thoughts about about the space and your friend? And they're not necessarily positive immediately, right? But that's what you're looking for. How do you, as a product, as a company, how do you mitigate to make sure it's not necessarily about just ensuring that there's no bugs. It's about creating a clean, safe, pleasant atmosphere in your home.
Yeah, and the second one, so a lot of my clients, I think, who've been with us for a while will recall when I had rats coming up the wall behind my wall here. And speaking of my dog, I was concerned about like how I was going to handle this problem, because Max, my Chihuahua, is the same size as a rat. So whatever was going to mitigate the rats, I was worried it would impact my dog. And that would be I guess the rodent control flip side to like what's holding you back from handling this problem. And so it's a more creative approach, because this is something that we want to see, right? Like we want to understand, like, yes, I want the pest control, I want the pest situation managed.
Yeah.
But I also, like, there's often gonna be something holding me back. And then maybe once you've invested in it, the last question that you have here of you're at a motel that appears to have invested heavily in pest control solutions. Having a highly visible solution is often indicative of a pretty significant problem. And that's gonna add additional dimension to how a solution is implemented. So you want to get the full picture, and this is going to result in like 3 very distinct stories.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just one open-ended question is going to tackle everything. You want to get the full mindset of the folks' journey. So level 3, unless you want to add anything, Mag, we'll go to level 3. Okay, level 3, if you are looking at another screen, this is where we say, come back to the webinar. We need your help, because this one is tough. Level 3 is Financial milestones. How do we fix this prompt? And please use the questions field or the chat or any mechanism you have available and help us figure out a better way of understanding like a solution for a financial institution. This is one where researchers will need to rely very heavily on the internal stakeholders, the CEO, the marketer, the product developer, to figure out what are the objectives for this study in order to curate appropriate questions. In the education example, pretty straightforward, right? We're trying to make education better. In the second one, a bit more creative. There's emotional drive. It takes more thought, but it's market researcher bread and butter. Like you guys do this all the time. And this one can be a bit tougher, right? So Meg, do you want to touch on anything on level 3 in the
No, honestly, this is that Kim and I have talked about it and gone back and forth several times, and you know, it's a combination of art and science of asking the right question, because if you really you know, have the right question, you might get much deeper responses, much more insightful elements of the story that you otherwise have not been able to come up with. So sometimes it's sort of the trial and error that you sort of, we've had situations where we prototype a question, see what kind of responses we get. If they're flat, we revise, we come back and then resend them again. You know, and it's all part of the design thinking. You know, try and see what comes out. I think it's a big one, and understanding the context and the objective and the fears and the aspirations that people have, for example, in context of financial services. You know, it really can reframe the way you ask a question ultimately.
Yeah, we bounced around this last question quite a bit because, like, using myself as an example, finances are not, balance sheets are not necessarily what interests me as much as the stories, right? So entering tax season, it was like, well, how would I research me with my limited bandwidth and limited level of care on some subjects? And back to the altruism drive, we all want next generations to have a better life than what we had. What changes need to happen for future generations to achieve what you wish you could? That one, I was able to generate a story from, right? Like, I want the Australian tax system where I just get a text that says, you owe this much, not okay, like that's my level of investment, but I could pull that example.
Yep, make it seamless.
It really, really would have been nice. So to summarize, and thank you all for holding on. You guys held on for 46 minutes in a half-hour webinar. So congratulations and good job. The passion-driven advantage being, got to have stories. People, if you understand people, you have to understand their stories. And the markets that have these identity-driven research objectives are going to have the advantage. And it may not necessarily feel like every market has that opportunity, but from the last slides, really anybody can have storyful data, and it's just a matter of working on that. And how to bridge the gap. Talk to us is the key here. Talk to a market researcher. Reach out to Mag, reach out to me. We'll get you connected to the right folks, because it comes down to the framing of the question. So from here, we have concluded. Good job, everyone. Do you guys have any questions that you would like Mag or I to answer? If you have any, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we have some backups if you guys are interested in those. Any? I can start with one of the things that will lead up to a webinar that we have coming up are, what are the ethics around driving passion in consumers? That's one that we'll talk about, I think, up in April. Looking forward to that one, because in researching this, we're talking about tapping into dopamine and you know, seeking the stories around folks. But we've also noticed that in some categories there are there's a bit of a line there that we want to explore. So I think we'll, quick spoiler on that, we'll explore the ethics and understanding people in that way. But aside from that, Mag, do you see any questions that you would like us to address? And I'll quit sharing my screen. I think we might be good.
I think that's it.
All right. So thanks, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you in our next one. If you know anyone who may benefit from attending this webinar or need to watch it, we'll be posting it to our YouTube channel. If you're watching the rerun on YouTube, like and share, etc. And it was good having you. And we'll see you at the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.